Hi, my name's Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. And this week, with my old mucker Jim Hancock, I'll be discussing Rachel Reeves's budget, Kemi Badenoch's response, and your party's conference in Liverpool.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, and this week it's just a double header, the dynamic duo, or as some would say, Dumb and Dumber. It's me, Frank McKenna, and Jim Hancock. No Joe Phillips this week, I'm afraid, but Jim, we've got plenty to talk about just in terms of unpicking this budget that Rachel Reeves presented. To say it was well trailed would be the understatement of the century. And I do wonder whether she's been too clever by half, because not only has she got to defend the measures that she took in the budget, some of which were controversial and people may support or may not, but nonetheless, measures that certainly put clear blue water between Labour and the Conservatives. I'm talking in particular, of course, about the lifting of the two-child benefit cap, and we'll come on to the merits and otherwise of that. But then she's been caught up in a row with the OBR, people from The Economists who sort of independent and watch these things with care, saying that she's misled the public in terms of some of the statements she's made, that she's been saying that this black hole and these challenges that she had were worse than they actually were, and she knew that that was the case. There were even briefings over the weekend from cabinet ministers suggesting that they felt as though they'd been misled as well. So once again, we see this government present something that's supposed to be a reset and enable them to move on and start talking about the issues that they want to talk about. And yet they are embroiled in another mess around whether or not Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was truthful in terms of what she gave in information in the lead up to the budget, I guess. We'll get in as well to the process that we now endure, because it's getting worse and worse. But my sense, Jim, initially after the budget was it was okay, relatively neutral, certainly good enough to keep her backbenchers happy and the parliamentary party happy, which was one of the jobs that she needed to do because of the turmoil that the leadership has been in recent months. But secondly, from a business perspective, not too much damage, but not enough to cheer about in terms of getting business back on side. What were your general thoughts on her performance on Wednesday and the budget generally?
Well, I think she was a bit, at the beginning of her presentation, she was a bit shaken by this extraordinary compounding of everything you said by the leaking of the budget beforehand. I mean, I was watching the coverage on TV, and Chris Mason and the economics editor just couldn't believe themselves. They were announcing what was going to be in the budget. So that just compounded the thing. And I know later on we'll talk about the Office of Budget Responsibility. But I mean, as I said in my blog, in terms of the two things that were really important to her, one political was, keeping the Parliamentary Labour Party happy so as not to provoke an immediate political crisis for herself. And more importantly, on behalf of all of us, the markets staying calm. It was a reasonably successful budget. I mean, I don't think we can overemphasize that. The real serious threat to the government would have been if the budget had not provided this elbow room, this buffer against eventualities, which was very thin on her first budget, and she was determined to make it greater, and therefore the markets have stayed calm, and that was really important. So in terms of those two things, it was a reasonably successful budget. But of course, in providing herself with that, I think it's £22 billion sort of safety net against eventualities. This is the reason that's being presented today for why she did what she did. And, obviously, she says in order to provide that, she had to warn the country that things were difficult, and therefore she's presented it in the way that she did. But of course, as we've discussed ad nauseam, this budget has been extraordinary in the length of time of speculation, setting the date in the first place so far into the winter. I think everybody now agrees was a mistake. But then compounding that with a sort of running commentary, politicians often say, "I'm not doing running commentaries," but we had this constant. I think it was partly to test the waters, which shows a lack of confidence really in your direction. Well, let's see how this goes down, and then pulling it back. But of course, the result for business and for the housing market has been disastrous, because a business, and more business people than I do, Frank, but what they crave almost above everything is some sort of certainty. Even if it's bad news, they can plan the development of their companies around it. But not knowing has caused a great deal of lack of investment this autumn, and in the housing market as well, and therefore we have this crisis this morning. Now, obviously, the Conservatives are going to make the most of this. They're calling for all sorts of inquiries. My instinct, I don't know what you think, is that it probably won't amount to anything in the long term. That we'll have another few days of this, probably up to Prime Minister's questions, and then I think it'll fade away as we start to try and concentrate on there are a large number of issues. I mean, in her decision not to go for an income tax increase in that way, although of course we'll talk about what's actually going to happen to pensioners in 28, 29. She's actually had to do a whole range of different things. There's some smorgasbord, as it's called, and there's a lot of things for us to discuss on that front.
Yeah, I mean, she's basically gone for the buffet of tax increases rather than just go, right, I'm going to raise income tax by a couple of pence. And again, by all accounts, reading the inside information from the Cabinet and the Treasury, it was private polling that they did that suggested that would be not particularly well received by the electorate, and that's why she backed away from it. But why she felt the need, she wasn't definitely 100% going to increase income tax. Why she did that breakfast event only a couple of weeks ago beggars belief, and demonstrates once again, I'm afraid, the lack of political instinct that she and the Prime Minister and those around them seem to have or not have. Just to get into the detail then of some of the things that she has done, and let's start with the big announcement, which was the one that the backbench Labour MPs were waving their order papers furiously in support of, and that of course is the raising of the two-child benefit cap. Now, I did say last week that I thought that in some areas the Chancellor implemented policies which were brave because she was not necessarily going to get the credit for them. And again, I think I will give her another tick in the box as far as this is concerned, because she could have taken some of those borrowings and with sleight of hand move them into spending, which we will describe as revenue rather than capital spending, and not being as ambitious on infrastructure spend. She didn't do that. She's left that money in place to do what she said it was to do, which is to basically renew and regenerate a desperately needed infrastructure within the UK. So credit to her there. Similarly with the two-child benefit cap, because this is something that politically is dangerous for Labour. It opens them up to the charge that they are soft on people who don't work, and the response from Badenoch, which I thought was very good, and we'll get into a bit more detail later, but the phrase that stuck was, "This is a budget for Benefit Street," And that is where people will focus their attention as far as kids in poverty are concerned. However, the vast majority of children who have fallen into poverty are kids of working parents, and the money will go towards supporting people in work by and large. That will not stop the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and indeed the Tories finding the family of six who are on the dole and claiming all these benefits. So that is the political danger for her. However, by the end of this Parliament, 400,000 kids will have been lifted out of poverty. And that, for Labour MP, who's gone into politics exactly for that reason, to tackle things like child poverty, that will be a huge boost, and or to enable the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to get those MPs to take some tougher decisions down the line on our welfare spend. And Pat McFadden, and of course the Timms review, which is due any time now, will hopefully enable them to do that. But of course, we're saying hopefully. We don't know that that is going to be the case. So before I move on to the other things in the budget, let me get your view, Jim, on that lifting of the two-child benefit cap. I know that you've expressed your concerns both in terms of the politics of it, but just in terms of whether generally it is a good policy to adopt.
Well, I still have my doubts. I mean, I listened to what you said last week, and you make a very valid point that most of these people are actually working parents, and then therefore they're not open to this charge that they're all sort of staying at home while other people get up to work. But it is there's some complicated calculations been done over the weekend about how much. I think there's a family with 2 or 3 kids where people are working have to earn about £70,000 in order to be equal to a family. And you identified it. The ones the male will be going after have got 6 kids at home, and they're all earning benefits, and therefore really working people have to earn a huge amount of money in order to support them. So this argument is going to go on. So I've still got my reservations, and there are arguments about what do you mean by poverty and this relative poverty. I'm uneasy about it because you've spoken with feeling about it, and you also said it's a sort of a gut issue for Labour MPs. They're just going to have to try and ride this particular criticism, but if Pat McFadden is allowed, and he's been very quiet over this budget period, he seems to me to be a crucial figure because I think the only way that Labour can counter this politically, I mean, they'll hopefully be able to say, these children have been brought out of poverty, but things like the Reform Party put it very crudely, people with mild anxiety going on to benefits. Now, that's a crude Reform style sort of way of presenting it that we were getting used to, unfortunately.
Well, true.
well, okay. So that's what they're going to need to tackle. They're going to have to, we want to see like people having face-to-face interviews with people who are not disposed to just sort of wave them through onto benefits. That we try and find out what the issues are behind this mild anxiety and things like that, and get tougher on putting people on benefits in the first place. If by the next election they can present this is a total package, yes, we did decide to do this for child poverty, but we have made substantial reforms to the welfare system, because at the moment she's stashed away billions more money for increased welfare benefits running up to the next general election.
Well, the increase would go up to £400 billion, which is simply not sustainable. And I think the other disappointing thing for me, as far as that argument was concerned, is there is an economic argument to be made, and they didn't make it because it costs the country a fortune when those kids fall into ill health or don't attain what they could attain educationally, and therefore we've got this huge skills gap in the workplace, for example. Many local authorities are now paying north of 80 pence in the pound towards social care and supporting these children. But there was no economic case made. It was all hearts and flowers. And oh, isn't it terrible that these poor kids are in poverty? And of course it is. But sometimes you've got to make the hard-nosed argument about the sense of the economics in this. And of course, you can only do that if you put this change alongside radical reform of the welfare system. And she went there for a couple of seconds, actually. And it was the point in which Mel Stride, your friend, was particularly uncomfortable because she pointed at him and said, you were the one that removed the need for people to have face-to-face interviews to get signed off sick. And we are going to reintroduce that. So she's already sort of committed the government to doing that. And by the way, she doesn't need to take that to Labour MPs. That is just something that you change the guidelines on, and the Working Pensions Minister can do that tomorrow, and hopefully they will. And Pat McFadden, I'm guessing, will be going through those sort of changes that he can do without necessarily referring it to Parliament. If he doesn't, we would be in a situation where on the current rules, the projection is another 500,000 people between now and the end of this Parliament will go on the sick. As I say, just not sustainable. We've got to start to tackle this issue, and part of it will be, I think, Pat McFadden's ability to do these things without, as I say, going to his backbenchers and asking for permission. But there will be a need at some point to get legislation through that significantly reduces that bill. So we will see what happens with that welfare package. But I do think that, as I said earlier, they gave Kemi Badenoch the opportunity of the Benefit Street soundbite. And politically, Jim, you're absolutely right. They haven't won the argument. Most people see that as something that is a sop to Labour MPs and also to people who, the undeserving poor, if I can put it that way. And it's a horrible term, but there you go. That's what the people out there are thinking. So let's move on to the other big decision that she made, which was basically to freeze tax thresholds, which brings in over £5 billion worth of taxes, I think it is. But of course, what this means in simple terms is that as people's salary grows, they get in very quickly, more quickly, into the higher rates of tax. And in the end, even Rachel Reeves had to concede that this will hit, and I hate this term, but they continue to use it, working people. That, Jim, is something that, in my view, she is hoping not to have to do, in the belief that something may turn up between now and 2020 and 2028.
Yes, well, this is referring to the end loading of a lot of this, which is very odd because, as I said in my blog last week, you know, the normal pattern of budgets in the 5-year cycle is you do the hard stuff early on, getting ready for the sweeteners in 28, 29. But as you've identified, a lot of these things click in towards the end of the Parliament. And, you know, the speculation has to be that she's praying that the growth happens, that the prosperity increases. And then in the 28 budget, she can say, I am now able to say that I do not have to freeze the allowances. But it's a real gamble, because if they have to come in, as I understand it, by then, with the triple lock still in place, and we could discuss that because that's been the great unmentionable again, the state pension will start to attract income tax. And she said, you know, and again, this is sort of a bit of a theme, isn't it, with the government? Oh, well, we'll take special measures to prevent that happening. But, you know, it goes to this point that to people who don't follow this as intensively as you and I do, it's all sophistry. You know, if you freeze benefits, and the Tories started this, Labour's just extending it to 2031. If you freeze the allowance levels, you drag people into income taxes as things go on, and it is a tax. And you know, and the more the debate goes on around it. People just say, you might have a technical point, but it's the overall impression. And the fact is, and of course, the word we have a new word, Frank, contribution. Yeah, as if we're all being asked to sort of, put something in the Christmas charity box. We have to make a contribution. And and again, going back to our previous discussion, the contribution will be towards people who are staying at home and living on benefits. You can see how the Tories are going to put this now. But let's be in no doubt, the continuing allowance freeze is an income tax increase.
Yeah, and the problem that Rachel Reeves has, I'm afraid, and nobody is more critical of the previous government than I, but she was jumping up and down when Jeremy Hunt used this sleight of hand in his, I think he did 2 or maybe 3 budgets and froze allowances for an extended 2 or 3 years. And she was saying, this is just a con. And she was right then, and she's right now. Because I don't know what these changes equate to in terms of an income tax increase. If you to transfer over to the mainstream tax take. However, with Jeremy Hunt, it resulted in a 4p increase in income tax. Had he simply gone to the House and said, I'm going to raise this money through income tax. So you're quite right, Jim. It's a political stunt, and it's one, as I say, that she will now be hung on because she was so critical of it. Similarly with the national insurance increase that she hit employers with in her first budget. She said when Hunt did that, it was a tax on jobs. And yet she came in her first budget and did it twice over. So I do think that she's getting herself embroiled in a mess because, as we've said before on this podcast, they don't appear to have a strategy. So I think this budget was probably tactically astute enough to see them through for the next 6, 7, 8 months. And as I say, keep the parliamentary party on board. And the important point that you made, Jim, the market's on board. But long term, strategically, I'm not sure whether it tells us where the government wants to go or is going. The other point that is being made by 1 or 2 people is yet they may be hoping that something turns up between now and 2029, or they may be thinking people will be a little bit better off in the pocket. Minimum wage, a freeze in terms of, I think, £150 off energy bills, I think that they announced. 1 or 2 other things as well. And if the cost of living crisis, which is now the priority, apparently overgrowth, which was the priority for the first 15 months, now it's tackling the cost of living crisis. They may, if they start to improve in the polls, if people start to feel a little bit better off, 2028 might be the date for the election that they've penciled in, Jim.
Cool. That's interesting at the moment. I think they'll go as long as they can. But I just wonder, Frank, whether there is an appetite for a political party to stop all this nonsense and actually be frank with people. Would people prefer frankness? And as we've said before, or I've certainly said, I really think that last year was the chance for Labour to say we know we're going to come into office, we are going to put a penny on income tax because we are Labour and we're going to do X, Y and Z. I wonder whether somebody's going to grasp that, because at the moment it's just absolute political orthodoxy. You can't frighten the voters by saying you'll put up taxes and being honest. But I think people have been through this so many times now. Confidence in politicians is so low. Would a political party get respect by saying, this is what we're going to do? Yeah, we are going to do this and do that, and paint a complete design of what they're going to do in return for increasing tax or cutting tax, for that matter. This is going to happen. Adopt that approach to things rather than this oh no, we're not going to increase any tax and somehow there's a magic money tree. I just wonder whether a political party is going to pick up on that.
I think there's an opportunity for the Conservatives to do it, actually, because Labour's reputation terms of economic performance is not great, and they will begin to say over the next 2 years, if things don't improve significantly, we told you so. And of course, what Kemi Badenoch will continue to do now, and she started to do this in a conference speech, to give her credit, is focus on the economy, focus on enterprise, entrepreneurs, business, and that gives her a narrative. If they continue to go towards the immigration debate, then that's meat and drink for reform. The more that the Tories can move the discussion onto the economy, at this moment in time at least, in terms of flatlining growth, flatlining productivity, indeed reduce productivity and increase taxes, the better for the Conservatives. And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in the second part of today's podcast. But let's finish off in terms of Labour's budget, Rachel Reeves' statement on Wednesday, by going back to that thing I was talking about a moment or so ago, and it's what's the story? What's the strategy? What are they planning to do? And as I say, they came in saying the number one mission was growth. Growth was, I think it was mentioned at all. It was more about stability. It was about fairness. But we heard little in terms of growth, and we didn't really see anything. Indeed, the OBR have said, haven't they? There were no measures in this budget that particularly target growth. And so, again, as I said, in terms of those welfare reforms, which are desperately needed, what other members of that government now need to get on and do, and I'm thinking about Peter Kyle in business, I'm thinking about Steve Reed in local government, is the reforms, the deregulation that will enable people to build houses, people to invest in AI and innovation, and improve and increase that productivity issue, which has been so bad for us. And the other big, probably major disappointment for me was it sort of indicated she was going to go big on Brexit. She basically went, I think she said the word once. It was such another missed opportunity for her to be able to say, Brexit is costing us £100 billion a year in trade. That's £40 billion in tax. I wouldn't have to do any of these things if your lot wouldn't have introduced this nonsensical Brexit that we've had to put up with, which nobody now in the country thinks was a good idea. And so what we are going to do is rejoin the customs union, rejoin the single market. Let the Tories, some of them, kick off and go bananas, but that is the simplest way of restoring the great British economy. No bravery, no courage, hardly a word said on that, Jim. So for me, as I say, tactically probably astute, but strategically nowhere near what she needed to deliver.
I think this timidity on Brexit can only be explained by their fear of reform, because I mean the Tories probably won't touch it, but reform certainly won't, and they're constantly looking out for any traitors to the 2016 referendum decision. So I can only explain it on those grounds. And this is, we haven't mentioned the Liberal Democrats, but to be fair to Sir Ed Davey, that's their thing. They are calling for exactly what you've called for, and incidentally are adopting quite a robust attitude towards Donald Trump, who's been no friend of the EU either. But one thing I just want to mention, as you've raised the Brexit issue, something that's been slightly underreported this weekend, and it ain't good news on a number of fronts in relation to that. One of the key things that Keir Starmer came back from his summer negotiations with Europe was a defence arrangement whereby we'd be able to be heavily involved. Now, from what I can tell, because of France is demanding too much money, we're not going to have full access to that agreement, which is serious from what you've said in terms of, because it would have helped steer us in the direction that you've indicated economically as well. But of course, Putin will just be laughing his head off, saying, there you are, the European democracies are divided on on the whole defence issue. So that's my explanation for it.
Yeah. Well, the French have been silly as far as this is concerned, because they are placing politics with the big P ahead of security, because the UK is the best partner that France and the rest of the European Union could have as far as defence is concerned. And with the Ukraine war continuing to rage, and Poland saying that they think they're going to be next, it's quite incredible that the French have dug in as much as they have. We'll see how those negotiations go, but certainly that won't help in terms of UK-EU relations. And it does give people like Farage a stick with which to beat the EU with. And, I'm not sure he's wanting to go anywhere near the Russian debate at the moment for all sorts of other reasons. And I'm sure that's an issue we will return to in subsequent weeks. But let's take a short break. And when we come back, I'll be asking whether or not this is the time for Kemi and the Conservatives. Is this their reset moment? Is it something that they will be able to take advantage of, this budget, which, as Jim and I have said, was probably good for the Labour Party, but was it good for the country? We'll also be asking whether this process of budget is sustainable for the rest of the 21st century. And there's been something happening in Liverpool this week. Your party, my party, their party have been at their inaugural conference. So we'll be taking a quick look at that as well. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to this week's Downtown End Politics podcast with myself, Frank McKenna, and Jim Hancock. No Jo Phillips this week. Sadly, she is in Kent trying to sort out the Reform County Council. So she'll tell us next week how she's got on. That is a joke, of course. I believe she's away on holiday and enjoying a well-earned break, I'm sure. So, Jim, we mentioned a couple of times in the first part of this week's podcast Kemi Badenoch and her response to the Chancellor's speech. Now, in some parts, she has been criticised for being over the top in terms of her robustness and a bit mean, I think would be the phrase that many people would use. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, it was a bit too personal, and I thought the Chancellor was quite gracious yesterday in just sort of not hitting back at her in her interview with Kunzberg, just saying it's not the way I do things, and I thought she was quite gracious in not doing that. I mean, it has to be said that Badenoch is right that the Labour have dished it out a bit in the past, but it was quite noticeable how much personal attack there was on the Chancellor. Some of it, it's always a danger. It's obviously been written for her, and every possible joke and pun was crammed in there. And the trouble with that sort of style is it starts to seem artificial. So I think that was a bit of a problem. But on the wider point, she is beginning to gain her confidence, and she has quite an interesting style where she's sort of reacting to the mood of the House now rather than just ploughing on. And so she did make some effective points, and the key thing we've already mentioned, that she's been searching for a year for something to grip onto. It's like she's been leading the Conservative Party like a wheel spinning on ice, not getting anywhere at all, not getting any traction with voters at all. And it'll be interesting to see in the polls, which I imagine will come out fairly quickly, whether this Benefit Street attack is going to work. And you can begin to see the elements of an economic policy that she and her very talented Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride will bring forward, both on what they would do about benefits and also what they would actually do for business. Because the other front that could open up, and we maybe have time to just discuss this a bit, is this employment bill, which obviously Downtown's been campaigning on, where we have had a concession this week, but there's still a sort of feeling that business is being oppressed both financially and also legislatively that whilst the government says it's in favour of growth, it sort of seems to be doing everything it can to hold back business. And you can see that the opportunities for the Conservative Party, these are traditional opportunities, could be exploited by Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah, I think it does open up an opportunity, but that doesn't mean to say that the Conservatives of the past would necessarily have taken that opportunity. I think one of the things that they got themselves sucked into was this reform agenda of anti-woke, anti-immigration, and not much on the economics. Now, in recent months, and I think you made this point a week or two ago, Jim, Nigel Farage has recognised that he couldn't continue to have this economic policy that didn't really add up, didn't make any sense. Somebody suggested that there was about £400 billion of spending commitments and no way in which they've identified how it was going to be paid for. So he's rowed back on that. But I don't think Reform are seen as the party for the economy. I think Reform are very much seen as immigration, we'll sort that out for you. So if the Conservatives can come in and move the discussion and the debate on to what I would suggest is a more comfortable platform for them, and that is the economics, then Kemi Badenoch will have done a decent job. And she did, as I mentioned earlier, begin to do this in a conference speech, actually. So credit to her as far as that's concerned. In terms of whether she's a bit mean and a bit spiky and a bit personal, yes, she is. And it's not my style either. And it's not the way in which I would engage in a political discussion or debate. However, the vast majority of people in the country do not watch the budget. They see the soundbite. And the soundbite that sticks is Benefit Street. That was the story that many of the headline writers were focused on the following day. That is the thing that people out there have picked up on. And so she may just have registered with people, because up till this point, you're quite right, Jim, she hasn't really. Indeed, when pollsters have asked, what do you think of Kemi Badenoch, a lot of people have said, who's she? So if the only thing that she's managed to do from Wednesday is get people to acknowledge the fact that she is now the leader of the opposition, then she's taken a step in the right direction. As I say, I think it does open up a great opportunity for the Tories, both in terms of the economic agenda and in terms of the business agenda as well. So we will see. There is, I think, still work to do for them, because the numbers in terms of MPs are still significantly lower than they were, but significantly higher than Reform's. So they need to start to get a few people now, like I would say, Coutinho, for example, bit more of a profile, your mate Mel Stride, James Cleverly, or Tom Cleverly, if he's out of a job soon, he might be, the way he's carrying on. Those are the people that they need, I think, to start fronting the Conservative narrative, the Conservative story up. Not people like Jenrick, not people like Priti Patel, who I think, aside from the fact that I don't think their messaging is particularly helpful because it does play into that reform narrative and agenda, I think they are tarred far more so with the previous government brush than those other people that I've mentioned. So we'll see how they react and continue to perform. But I do think that it's been a pretty decent week, Jim, for the Conservatives.
Yes, I mean, Jenrick has been a bit quieter recently, and one hears from insiders that he's been sort of told to wind in his neck a bit by Kemi Badenoch in shadow cabinet meetings. So I think that, she's beginning to assert her power over her shadow cabinet, and he was the biggest danger to her in that respect. Can I just sort of mention one other thing? I mean, I obviously, Labour's constantly trying to shoot Tory foxes, and the employment bill and the removal now of this need for employers to give rights to workers on day one has been removed. And that's something that Downtown's been campaigning on. But this bill, I think, is still quite problematic for business, and therefore per our conversation that we're having, giving further opportunities for the Conservatives to say, we're pro-business and the government's anti-business. But I mean, do you think that this concession on first day rights is solved all the problems, or is not?
No, it's not solved all the problems. I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but I think they need to look at the ambiguity of harassment and who's responsible. We've got this daft thing at the moment where if, I'll give a live example, practical example. If one of our events team were at a downtown event and somebody said something untoward against them, I'm liable. And I just don't know how that's going to work in practical terms, but it's a real problem. I think the right to strike has been made far easier, far simpler. I'm not necessarily convinced that's a good thing. And there's other details in there as well. And we haven't even mentioned the increase in minimum wage for younger people that will act as a barrier for young people entering into the job market, I'm afraid. And hope that some of that challenge will be mitigated by the announcement that was made around apprenticeships, but I'm not convinced. So there's a lot for the Conservatives to go at. I know that Peter Kyle will be working hard to make those employment changes as business friendly as he possibly can. But we come back to that issue of the Labour backbenchers again, Jim, and the trade unions, who appear to have a far greater say in the direction of this government than we'd anticipated before the 4th of July 2024. So I don't know why that's happened, but it has. And I guess it's because, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, and some other members of the cabinet just do not like having the discussion, the debate, and laying the law down in a sense. You just can't imagine Blair or Brown bending over in the way that Starmer and Reeves have in terms of some of the demands that are being made by the PLP. But there you go. They don't like arguing, apparently. They don't like falling out with people. They don't like having those robust conversations. Well, you shouldn't be in politics if that's the case, I'm afraid, and maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, but the trade union thing is very interesting. They seem to be. I don't want to use Daily Mail things particularly, but in hock to the unions, and a large number of trade unions do very good work. But the continuing problem is that the two strikes that keep on happening that are very unpopular with people are the doctors and railway drivers, who people feel have been well rewarded by the government, and yet they go on strike, and that's the sort of image of the trade unions still have to counter. I mean, Paul Novak, who's the general secretary of the TUC, doesn't have the sort of profile of people from my day, like Vic Feather and people like that who are in and out of number 10 Downing Street all the time with Harold Wilson. But it is interesting. But before we finish, I want to, if you're happy to come on to the whole question of the budget strategy and things like that.
Well, we did. I mean, we'll put the blog that you wrote last week and my blog in the notes, so that people can take a look. But my view last week was that I knew you were going to do the analysis in terms of how you felt the budget had gone, and there's loads of that, isn't there, out there, and I did a live sort of discussion with the Liverpool big company online with about 40 or 50 people online. So we'd sort of done that to death, I felt. So I wanted to take a sort of backward step and a more macro view of the whole process. And we've been saying for weeks now, haven't we, what a joke this budget process is. And I think it's been worse this time around, but it's got increasingly worse. This has been something that has started to happen, I think, with Alistair Darling, and has just got worse and worse and worse. And George Osborne started to trail his budgets, and then the Chancellor after that, The only one that didn't trail the budget really was Kwasi Kwarteng, and obviously that ended up as an absolute car crash. But I think that the OBR projections are too short term, and so don't work for the country, and certainly don't work for chancellors if they're looking to do something radical, because it does then inevitably spook the markets if your independent advisors are saying, oh, this isn't going to work in the next 3 to 5 years. At the very least, we need to extend their vision and projections to 10, 15 years, because
so you're not calling for its abolition then?
I don't think so at this. I mean,
because I would say that's sending the referee off the pitch. Putting it back in the hands of politicians would be.
Yeah, the problem is, but you see, this is where it comes down, doesn't it? To, do we have a democracy or not? Are we electing people to make decisions, or we're electing people to keep 3 people happy? And it seems to me that we're now, we've given the Bank of England independence to set interest rates. Now we've got a further group of bureaucrats who are telling us what the Chancellor's decisions actually mean. And it's all subjective, by the way. I've heard 5, 6, 7 economists now all telling me different things in terms of what this budget does. So just because they've got this magic 3 letters attached to them, OBR, doesn't mean that they're any better, brighter. And in fact, their fucking projections are usually wrong. In fact, Rachel Reeves made that point herself, didn't she, in terms of growth? She said, well, last year the OBR said our growth would be 0.7. It's 1.5 this year. So the OBR, for me, should it be abolished? Whether it should be abolished, it certainly should be reformed. It shouldn't be able to dictate in the way it does. And a couple of percentage points this way costs the country billions of pounds, spooks the markets. This is no way to run a country, so needs to be reformed. But the other change I'd make, and I did reference this last week before maybe, we've got to introduce Purdah. I was listening to a fabulous podcast with Ken Clark on the newsagents, and he was saying you would never have got away as Chancellor with trailing the budget in the way that Rachel Reeves did this time, which Jeremy Hunt did, which Sunak did. It's nonsense. And it's, aside from anything else, it is disrespectful to Parliament. It is bringing Parliament into disrepute. And I was delighted that the Speaker, or the Deputy Speaker, gave the Chancellor a bit of a rollicking, because it can't continue like this. We've got to start to have a budget which is an annual event where we're all left guessing. And we have to wait until the Chancellor takes to her feet. OK, 1 or 2 things often leak out. But there was nothing in that budget that we hadn't heard trailed you. Not one thing. And the big announcement, the rabbit out the hat, the 2-child benefit cap, and our producer Francesca will tell you, we were at an event a month ago nearly, Francesca, she's nodding, and Labour MPs were saying very openly, oh, the 2-child benefit cap's going. So we can't have this training of the budget in the way that we've seen in recent times. The OBR, I think, need to have, if not be abolished, their wings significantly clipped. And we've got to be able to have a process in place which enables the country to crack on and not have this constant speculation of what is the Chancellor going to do in her next budget. And that stopping people from investing, stopping people from taking new staff on. It's not helped at all, Jim. If you can tell me one thing that this process has improved, then I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm looking at your blog here, and I've got various points to make. And perhaps I'll make them all, and then you can come back on them. Because you seem to still favour an annual budget, because you did actually say announcements, statements, and policy changes as and when required, and that seems to suggest lots of sort of mini budgets. Then you said, major mandatory consultation with business, consulting business, model the impact, publish the findings, proceed or revise. Criticism of that would be you're giving business too much influence, and that politicians have got to be able to imprint their views, like
Can
they
I
have
just
done.
intervene on that
Yeah,
particular point? Just
yeah.
on that particular point. And you know, you basically said you don't want to abolish the OBR because those three men, I think it's three men, that they basically should be able to dictate to the Chancellor what she does in her budget, but you don't want her to consult mandatorily with business.
Well, I think, aren't you overemphasizing the role of the Office of Budget Responsibility? I mean, they are
How,
advisory at the end of the
how,
day.
oh, come on, Jim. Really? I mean, every time they sneeze, the country catches a cold. You know, it was a few, don't forget where the big wobble came when the OBR were suggesting, apparently, the productivity levels were going to drop more than the 0.3% that was eventually the figure that they landed on. That's when the markets wobbled. So the OBR has a huge influence now, way above what I would suggest George Osborne intended when he introduced the OBR.
This goes to I mean, we agreed earlier that business loves certainty, but I would just put in the other column, one of the reasons why the OBR does vary its forecast is because we live in an unstable world. Things change, and as much as business might want certainty, you know, this government, we're a moderate-sized power. We are knocked sideways with headwinds of a global nature that we can't control, and therefore the OBR, in a sense, is reflecting that. You know,
but who are the OBR, Jim?
So you're calling for grown-ups in the room. I mean, to some extent,
I'm asking you who the OBR are. You know, in the end, we, as I said earlier, you know, it's as if they've got some sort of crystal ball that they can see clearly into the future. None of the fucking projections are ever right. If they were getting everything right, you'd go, oh, bloody hell, those guys are geniuses. But you have the OBR making statements and projections. You have economists on the other side of the column saying this is ridiculous. Why do we elect politicians, Jim? Isn't this falling into the trap that the European institutions eventually fell into, and why it was so easy for people like Farage, for Johnson, for Gove to say, take back control? And at some point, when you were saying earlier, what's the narrative that can be created to be straight with the British people? Won't some party say, this is ridiculous? You're electing politicians here, and the politicians aren't making the decisions. They're being told by this crowd over here, no one's elected, you don't even know, never heard of. They're making all the decisions, really.
Well, in the old days, I mean, obviously we have the independence of the Bank of England, which is one strand of this. But in the old days, politicians, you know, elected politicians, they've got the right, as you eloquently say, they manipulated the message very, very strongly. And that's why these institutions were set up. But just finally, on this question of leaks, you know, making it a major fiscal measure, a disciplinary offence to reveal them. You know, find the culprits, Frank. I mean, it's all very well calling for purdah and things like that, but you know, I mean, you're talking about armies of people.
Story, Jim.
How are you going to find the culprits?
Let me tell you a story, and you will remember this well. And again, I think it was Ken Clarke. It was Ken Clarke, in fact. Ken Clarke, in his last budget in 1992. In the old days, of course, the Chancellor was in charge of the budget. There was no independent Bank of England and there was no OBR. And Ken Clarke, I think, was a very good Chancellor and left an economy that was improving. So it would have been 96, wouldn't it? His last budget, not 92, sorry. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, the budget goes to the printers, and because the London Evening Standard was seen as a major major newspaper at that time, and was printed a little earlier than other papers, they wanted to give the Evening Standard the heads up. Oh, that was Osborne who fucked up with the Evening Standard. No, let's stick with me Ken Clarke story. the printers ran off the budget and inadvertently delivered a copy to the Daily Mirror the night before the budget, Jim. You not remember this?
No.
Right. The night before, Piers Morgan had Ken Clarke's, what turned out to be, final budget in his hands in its entirety. What did the Daily Mirror do, Jim?
Well, I imagine they didn't do anything with it out of respect for the Chancellor.
They respected the Chancellor, they respected the budget, they respected, I would suggest, the country. And what they did to make some political capital out of it, because of course the Daily Mirror is a Labour paper, is they made great play of the fact that the journalist who'd received the report delivered it back to number 11. So they had a bit of fun with it. What they didn't do was release the detail. So could we not introduce legislation that said, I know this is difficult in the days of social media, but people recognise that social media is a lot of fake news there. So you get something in on Twitter or whatever it might be, and you're not necessarily taking it on. Say to the press, we'll take you to court. If you print leaks about the budget, if you suggest that something is going to happen in the budget, we will take you to court. Not allowed. Stop the leaks. Stop that sort of nonsensical talk that damages markets and damages the economy. I don't see what the problem is with that. In the past, your mob used to respect the budget. But if politicians and Treasury officials don't respect the budget, why should the media? If the media, though, say, we're not allowed to print any of these leaks, stops the leaks, yeah?
It's just not practical. I mean, there is a thing called. Of course,
what happens?
There's a thing called the
What's different to 1996 to 2026, Jim? You know, which is where we're heading for the next budget. Why are we in this ridiculous situation where we've ended up with your mate Chris Mason almost orgasmic and trying to blame the Chancellor, by the way, for the OBR's leak? I mean, fuck me. If ever the veil was, if anyone needed proof that that guy was, if not reformer Tory, Christ almighty, it was, as I say, his reaction to the OBR's report being leaked the hour or so before. Oh, the Chancellor, nothing to do with it.
So you're saying,
and Chris Mason was absolutely delighted, and the television, the BBC, Sky, they all did it.
Yeah.
You know, going through it line by line before she'd taken to her feet. Wouldn't it have been lovely if the media would have said, there's been a total and utter cock up by the OBR, they've released the budget, but out of courtesy to the Chancellor and for the country, we are not going to release it. The details will be announced by the Chancellor. Wouldn't that have been great? Wouldn't that have been refreshing from your colleagues in the media to do that?
It might have been, but it's completely unrealistic. We're not in 1996. We're in the age of social media and things like that, and if journalists are given an opportunity like that, they're going to go for it full-heartedly.
So basically, traditional journalists, mainstream media say to me, oh, it's absolutely disgraceful what happens with social media, and then every time you fucking basically want to be horrible, you say, oh, well, we've got to be because of social media.
But
why can't we level up, Jim? Why can't we level up? Why can't mainstream media say we're going to be better than that? So if social media wants to continue to be the Wild West, then they can continue. If mainstream media perhaps adopted a more mature approach, a more respectful approach, then perhaps people would start to take mainstream media more seriously again, and social media will become less influential.
Well,
we've gone a long way from the process of the budget, by the way.
Yes, okay, but just on this, I mean, you might be able to define some sort of law which said you couldn't disclose the actual budget itself, but where's the line to be drawn between the constant chat that goes on between politicians and journalists? where you give me a sort of slight steer on something and I publish something saying, oh, they might be looking at income tax. Is that a leak of a budget secret, or is it just legitimate speculation that the press can go into? I think it's unpoliceable what you have in
note,
mind.
Jim, I think it would be very easy. On a serious note, I think it'd be very easy to stop an awful lot of this. You're never going to be able to stop everything. But I think the Speaker of the House should take his gloves off in advance of the budget next year. Once the date is set, Lindsay Hoyle and the Deputy Speaker, in fact, doesn't the Deputy Speaker have more of a say over this because she is the chair of the Ways and Means?
Ways and Means, yes. That's why she takes the chair.
So that's why she takes the chair. So she should be on her feet as soon as that date is announced, and never mind waiting for the Chancellor to give the budget. Say then to the Chancellor and to her officials, I will drag you before this House if I see the sort of nonsense that took place in 2025. You will be dragged before me, and I will be asking very serious questions of you and demanding inquiries, meaningful inquiries of your officials should leaks continue in the way that we've seen over the past few years.
Well, there has
it's
been
ridiculous, Jim.
I mean, the Speaker, on not only on budget issues but on a number of others, has been conducting a relentless campaign criticising this government, and it's not just this government; it's happened in the past, but this government particularly for pre-announcing things outside the House of Commons and disrespecting the Commons. Lindsay Hoyle has been on his feet a number of times. Now, you've outlined what sort of sanctions he has, and the truth of the matter is he hasn't. And I notice now that ministers, after these rebukes, hardly acknowledge them and just plough on.
I don't know, Jim. I think to be threatened by before that starts, before the nonsense starts, and you can't do it across all departments, impossible. But for the budget, this should be seen as something that is sacrosanct. It's a big fiscal event. It's the only fiscal event now. She's done away with the mini budget. So it is not beyond the wit of Parliament to put the brakes on this absolute farce, chaos. It was a clown show. And okay, the OBR leaking the report the hour before, can't blame the Chancellor for that. But it did epitomise the whole process, I thought. It did make people go, well, what do you expect? Because it's just a joke now, this. So I do think that I'm only half serious about what I was saying over the media, but I do think that the politicians themselves have got to be far more disciplined moving forward. And Treasury officials, it's a jailable offence. I mean, they are, influencing the markets. That's illegal.
There is a thing called the D notice system for security matters,
Yes.
where the press are issued with a D notice. There was a big row about this way back in Harold Wilson's time, whether this was, actually censoring the press. But there is a draconian thing called the D notice thing in relation to security. Whether you want to see it applied to financial matters is interesting.
As I say, I'm not an expert in these things by any sense. By any stretch of the imagination. But if we think that this is a good process, then goodness me, we're kidding ourselves. We've got to get onto surer footing when we're talking about something as serious as the presentation of a budget. But anyway, have a read of my blog, see what you think. Those were ideas that I was sort of writing down on the back of a fag packet. So I'm not wedded to any of them. I don't mind anybody responding and saying it's a load of rubbish, as long as you've got some alternatives. And if you think that the situation that we've got at the moment is fine, then I think you're a fucking nut job. But there you go. It's your prerogative. It's your prerogative. Well, you don't think the current process is fine, Jim.
No, I think
you might not agree with you may not agree with the alternatives I've suggested, which is fine. But I think we could both agree this process is now not fit for purpose, yeah?
Indeed. Almost as chaotic as your party.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, let's come on to that. That's a great segue. You can see you used to be in the media, people, can't you? Either way, just switches like this. So your party were in Liverpool at the weekend. This is Jeremy Corbyn and Sultana's Sarah Sultana's party, of course. And it's not been the easiest of starts for your party. Indeed, there was a suggestion that they were going to change the party name, but apparently they're not going to do that now. There were apparently 13,000 people expected to descend upon the arena in Liverpool the weekend for the inaugural Your Party conference. In the end, 2,500 people turned up. And I have to say to you, Jim, for people like me who've observed the left for many years now, this wasn't a surprise. It was all about points of order. It was all about traitor to the working class. It was all about debates on the floor and trying to win internal battles. They're just not serious politicians, these people. They are playing at it. And it went exactly as I'd predict it would go. Shambolic, Jim.
Yes, the collective, I mean, a number of problems here, but I mean, just to reflect on this, the far left and the far right do have this propensity to split. I mean, you know, going back to my student days, we had the International Marxist Group, the Communist Party of England, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, Socialist Workers' Party, and there is that propensity to lift people who feel very passionately but completely unrealistically about their beliefs. And of course it's mirrored on the far right as well, and even to this day you've got out and out Nazis and factions like that that have been prescribed actually, and then you've got British National Party and National Front and all that, and all those sort of organizations as well. So this is not an unusual phenomenon, but there was a moment as the disillusionment with the incoming Labour government happened, that it looked as if your party was going to be the recipient of quite serious challenge for the Labour Party from people who think Labour lacks values and lacks purpose in terms of equality in this country. But obviously two things have happened. One, which you've masterfully indicated, the splits and so on between Sultana and Corbyn. But also, of course, we've seen the emergence of Zach Polanski as leader of the Green Party, a very eloquent young man. I think you and I would agree many of his aims unrealistic, but nevertheless a great media performer who's managed to galvanise the Green Party and has so far defied my prediction that there could be a huge tension between Greens, people who in the Green Party who absolutely prioritise the environmental concerns, and Zach, who seems more concerned on the social front and equality front. And he's got his act together, whereas I'm afraid the Liverpool spectacle was very difficult. Just two last points. This collective leadership in this day and age where the media craves a spokesperson. I mean, the Greens used to have this problem with dual leaders, but this is going to be a collective committee. So, you know, inevitably somebody's going to emerge from that, or more than one, and it'll be quite messy. And I think also there's been a big row about, I think Sultana wants to keep sort of, you know, to use an old-fashioned phrase from my student days, no enemies to the left, you know, this sort of indulgence aren't actually in your party and actually, you know, further to the left, that they can have access to the party. So it hasn't been a great start, and I would have thought, I know you've got some interesting thoughts on what Zara Sultana actually should have done.
I think she should have joined the Green Party, but I think her ego has stopped her. You know, people always associate big egos with fellas, and usually they're right. But I can only assume that is what started. You know, Zach Polanski is ensconced now as the leader, a very impressive leader of the Green Party. She's looked at that option and thought, well, he ain't got to share the leadership with me, so I'm sitting where I am. You know, just in terms of let's get to basics here. You know, women's rights. There are some people who sit very comfortably in your party at the moment who do not share Sarah Sultana's view of equality, or mine for that matter. So I think it's a strange grouping of people. I suspect it will not have a second party conference, certainly with the personalities that are involved now. And they'll be lucky to get 1,500 next year, never mind 2,500. So, yeah, not surprised. Bunch of trots, Marxists, anarchists, lunatics, and going nowhere fast. Still polling apparently about 10%, which just shows you how many lunatics there are in this country. But there you go. Jim, is there anything else we need to discuss? Just very briefly, because we're recording this. It's now nearly 11 o'clock on Monday morning. Keir Starmer is on his feet, and the BBC are reporting that he's basically talking about welfare reform. So there you go. Maybe he is rolling the pitch for those changes that we were saying the government need to introduce if they are to keep people's support. He's welcomed, obviously, the change to the two-child benefit cap, as making the point I made in terms of many of those people who will be beneficiaries are in work. Vast majority of them are, of course. However, he is saying that reform of the welfare state more generally is required as well. So we will see how that speech goes. And he's defending his chancellor, saying she didn't lie, she never lies, she's never lied in her life. He didn't say that. I'm just paraphrasing. Jim?
Well, just very briefly, their relationship is very closely tied together. And we have seen instances in British politics where Margaret Thatcher fell out with Nigel Lawson spectacularly and had her differences with Geoffrey Howe when he was Chancellor. And obviously the Blair Brown thing, which I continue to feel sad about, actually, because it was a distraction from an otherwise very good government. So we don't seem to see these tensions between Starmer and which is a good thing in one sense for them both. But on the other hand, they stand together or they fall together. And so clearly this speech is enhancing that relationship. But as you've said, it's also indicating that they are aware that having done the two-child benefit, they do need to focus on welfare reform.
Yes, and that message hopefully will get through to the Parliamentary Labour Party as well. Right, James, it's been good to talk to you. And yeah, he didn't bite on the Chris Mason thing. Francesca was trying to get him going on the BBC again, but he wasn't having any. So we'll have a go next week. I'm sure Laura Koonsberg will be ready to get Richard Tice or Nigel Farage back on a programme on Sunday, so can have a pop at you then. Great to see you, Jim. Sorry about your team, but my team didn't do much better on Saturday either. 4-1 against Newcastle.
We'd be better off with James Cleverly as our manager at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to have a pop at David Moyes because he's done well since he returned. But yeah, that wasn't a great performance on Saturday. After the Lord Mayor's show, of course, because a great performance the previous Monday evening at Manchester United at Old Trafford, where we went down to 10 men and managed to come away with a 1-0 victory. So football, it's almost as unpredictable as politics. We will see you all again next Monday. Thanks for listening. Thanks as ever to our producer, Francesca King. And hopefully Joe Phillips will be back to interject with some common sense next week and stop us two wittering men falling out with each other. See you again next week. Bye.